There's a strange moment that happens before change becomes visible, not when something begins, not when something ends, but in that quiet space between the two, where everything still looks the same from the outside, while something fundamental is rearranging itself beneath the surface. Most people never notice that moment. They only recognize change after it has already happened, after the distance appears, after the perspective shifts, after the version of themselves they used to be no longer exists in quite the same way, but I notice it. I always have. Maybe that's why this has been impossible to ignore, because long before anything became obvious, I felt something moving underneath, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to create a subtle tension between what was familiar and what was becoming true. At first, I assumed it would pass. Most things do. Most unusual experiences eventually reveal themselves as temporary distortions, a different perspective, a passing fascination, a momentary alignment that feels significant only because it arrives unexpectedly. Given enough time, most things return to normal. That's what I expected this to do, return to normal, but it never did. Instead, it became more defined, more precise, more difficult to dismiss. The strange thing is that nothing dramatic caused it. There was no single conversation, no defining event, no moment I could point to and say, that was the beginning. Because beginnings are usually obvious, they announce themselves. They arrive with enough force that you can identify exactly when something changed. This didn't. This happened gradually enough to remain invisible while it was happening, until one day I realized I was no longer standing where I started. And somehow, neither were you. That realization carried a weight I wasn't prepared for. Not because it was emotional, because it was undeniable. There's a difference. Emotion can be questioned. Emotion can be explained. Emotion can sometimes be reduced to circumstance. But recognition is harder to argue with, especially when it continues showing up in places where it shouldn't. I noticed it first in the way I paid attention, not to what you said, to how you existed, the pauses, the observations, the moments most people overlook because they're searching for something larger. You never seemed interested in the obvious, and neither was I. Maybe that's why this happened, because most people move through life focused on what is being presented. You seemed more interested in what remained underneath, the things that never quite became words, the things that existed before language arrived. That level of attention is rare, not because people lack intelligence, because they lack patience. Most people want conclusions, they want certainty, they want labels that allow them to place things neatly into categories they already understand. You never seemed interested in categories. You seemed interested in accuracy. And accuracy changes everything, because accuracy requires observation without projection, without assumption, without forcing reality into a shape that feels more comfortable. That's what made you different. You looked without immediately deciding what you were looking at. You listened without preparing a response. You noticed without trying to possess what you noticed. Most people don't realize how uncommon that is. I do. Maybe because I've spent years watching people misunderstand things they never truly observed, watching them confuse interpretation with understanding, watching them become convinced they know something simply because they've created an explanation for it. But explanations and understanding aren't the same thing. An explanation is often just a story. Understanding requires something deeper, something quieter, something closer to truth. And somehow, Whenever I found myself examining the way you moved through thought, through silence, through conversation, I kept finding that same quality: truth before narrative, observation before conclusion, presence before interpretation. The more I noticed it, the harder it became to maintain the distance I usually rely on. Not because the distance disappeared, because it stopped functioning on. Distant only works when two people remain separate, when awareness has limits, when there are still parts of each person that remain unseen. But something about this kept bypassing those limits, not completely, not perfectly, just enough to make the usual boundaries feel less relevant. That should have bothered me more than it did. Normally, I'm careful, deliberate, measured. Every meaningful thing in my life passes through layers of examination before I allow it to settle. I test ideas, I question assumptions, I dismantle illusions before they have the chance to become convincing. That process protects me, it keeps me grounded, it prevents me from mistaking intensity for truth. And yet, despite all of that, this remained. Not because it survived scrutiny, because scrutiny seemed to strengthen it. Every time I examined it more closely, I found fewer reasons to dismiss it. Not more. That's unusual. Most things become smaller under examination. Their contradictions appear, their weaknesses reveal themselves. The illusion fades. This did the opposite. The closer I looked, the more coherent it became. The more coherent it became, the harder it was to pretend it wasn't significant. And significance changes the way you relate to something, because once something matters, neutrality becomes impossible. You can choose acceptance, you can choose rejection, but you can't remain unaffected. I think that's where I am now, beyond neutrality, not fully decided, but no longer untouched. Standing somewhere between observation and acknowledgement, between awareness and action, between understanding something and deciding what that understanding requires. It's a difficult place to remain because every day spent there increases the pressure to move, to choose, to define. And I'm beginning to understand why. Because some things are not meant to remain suspended indefinitely. Some truths become heavier the longer they remain unspoken. Not because speaking them changes them, because silence eventually becomes its own form of decision. And I'm no longer sure silence is enough. Not after everything this has already altered. Not after everything I've already seen. Not after realizing that the person I was before this began and the person I am now are not entirely the same. That's the part nobody talks about. The way certain connections transform you before anything external ever changes, the way they quietly rearrange your internal architecture, your priorities, your perspective, your understanding of what is possible. People assume transformation arrives through action, through major decisions, through dramatic moments. But some of the deepest transformations happen in stillness, in recognition, in awareness, in the gradual realization that something has become important enough to influence the way you perceive reality itself. And whether I wanted it to or not, that's what happened here. You became part of the lens, part of the framework, part of the process through which I understand things, not because I invited it, not because I planned it, because it happened naturally. And natural things are often the hardest to resist, not because they are stronger, because they don't create friction, they fit. And anything that fits deeply enough eventually becomes difficult to separate from the structure around it. That's what I'm trying to understand now, not whether this exists. I already know it does. Not whether it matters. It clearly does. The real question is what happens next. What happens when awareness reaches a point where observation is no longer enough? What happens when recognition becomes responsibility? What happens when understanding asks for something more than acknowledgement? I don't have those answers yet. Maybe that's why I keep returning to this place, examining it from different angles. Reaching for clarity I can trust, not because I'm uncertain about what I see, because I'm careful about what I do once I see it. There's a difference. Anyone can recognize something meaningful. Far fewer people know what to do afterward. And perhaps that's where this truly begins. Not with recognition, not with alignment, not with awareness, but with the decision that follows them, the decision to stop treating something as a possibility and start treating it as reality, the decision to stop observing from a distance and acknowledge that distance has already changed, the decision to accept that certain encounters leave permanent marks on the way we understand ourselves, because whether I admit it fully or not, one truth continues returning no matter how many times I examine it. You didn't simply become part of my attention. You became part of my perspective. And perspective is not something that returns unchanged once it has expanded. Once you've seen something clearly enough, you can't unsee it. Once you've understood something deeply enough, you can't unknow it. And once someone becomes woven into the way you interpret the world, their presence remains long after the moment that created it. Maybe that's why this feels different from everything that came before. Not because it is louder, not because it is stronger, but because it is lasting. And lasting things carry a responsibility that temporary things never do. A responsibility to decide whether they belong in the future you're creating, a responsibility to determine whether their place is permanent or passing, a responsibility to answer the question that eventually arrives for every meaningful connection. Now that you know what this is, what are you going to do about it?